Let's dig into my philosophy and secrets.
Understanding Smith's foundational insights reveals how individual human motivations, when channeled through appropriate institutional frameworks, can generate collective benefits that far exceed what any single person could achieve alone. Adam Smith is recognized as the father of modern economics, with his revolutionary ideas laying the groundwork for economic theory during the Scottish Enlightenment. Born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, Smith's formative education and experiences at the University of Glasgow sparked his interest in moral philosophy and economics. His seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, argued against mercantilism and introduced foundational concepts like the division of labor and free market policies. These principles articulated how individual self-interest and competition could lead to economic prosperity, challenging the prevailing governmental doctrine of economic intervention. Understanding Smith's innovation provides insight into the natural mechanisms guiding economies, emphasizing the invisible hand's role in aligning individual interest with collective benefits. Smith's theoretical framework emerged from his deep engagement with moral philosophy, particularly his earlier work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which explored how individuals develop moral judgments through sympathy and social interaction. This philosophical foundation enabled him to understand economic behavior not merely as crude self-interest, but as part of broader human nature involving complex motivations, social relationships, and ethical considerations. His concept of the invisible hand represented a systematic discovery about how decentralized market mechanisms can produce ordered outcomes without central planning or coordination. Rather than viewing economic actors as purely rational calculators, Smith recognized that markets function through a dynamic interplay of human psychology, institutional structures, and incentive systems that channel individual behavior towards socially beneficial results. The operational mechanisms Smith identified include the division of labor, which increases productivity by allowing workers to specialize in specific tasks, and the price system, which serves as an information network transmitting knowledge about scarcity, demand, and opportunity costs across the entire economy. His analysis revealed how competition drives innovation and efficiency, as entrepreneurs seeking profit must continually improve products and reduce costs to survive market pressures. The price system functions as an automatic coordinating mechanism, where rising prices signal shortage and falling prices indicate abundance, guiding resources toward their most valued uses. These mechanisms work together to create what Smith called natural market prices that reflect true production costs and consumer preferences, rather than arbitrary political decisions. Contemporary applications of Smith's principles are evident in modern capitalist economies worldwide, where free market policies, deregulation initiatives, and international trade agreements reflect his advocacy for minimizing governmental economic intervention. The rise of digital platforms and gig economies illustrates his insights about decentralized coordination and specialization, as millions of independent workers and consumers interact through marketplace mechanisms without central planning. However, Smith's ideas also inform debates about economic inequality, as critics argue that unconstrained self-interest can lead to excessive wealth concentration and social instability. Current discussions about universal basic income, antitrust enforcement, and corporate regulation represent attempts to balance the efficiency gains from market mechanisms with concerns about fairness and social cohesion. The integrative implications of Smith's framework extend beyond economics to encompass fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. His insight that apparent chaos in markets actually reflects systematic patterns suggests that many seemingly intractable social problems may have natural solutions that emerge from properly designed institutional frameworks. This understanding provides a foundation for analyzing contemporary challenges such as climate change, technological disruption, and global economic instability, as well as exploring how individual incentives can be aligned with broader social goals. Smith's work thus offers a comprehensive lens for understanding not just economic behavior, but the deeper dynamics of human coordination and social evolution that continue to shape our world. Born in the small coastal town of Kirkcaldy, Scotland in 1723, Adam Smith emerged from humble circumstances to become the most influential economic thinker in human history. His revolutionary insights into market dynamics didn't emerge in isolation. They were built upon 17 years of deep meditation on the fundamental question of how human beings actually behave when making moral decisions. What you're about to discover is the ethical foundation that made the wealth of nations possible. Why do humans sometimes act morally, even when it costs them? How can selfish individuals create beneficial social outcomes? What makes some actions feel right while others feel wrong? What makes Smith's theory of moral sentiments unique is his revolutionary discovery that morality isn't imposed from above by society or religion, but emerges naturally from the structure of human psychology itself. This is the complete systematic exploration of every major insight from this groundbreaking work. Welcome to Sleepy Philosopher, where we explore the most profound ideas in human history slowly enough to truly understand them. Complex philosophy delivered at a pace that lets these concepts sink in. If this approach to philosophy resonates with you, consider subscribing and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Let's begin our journey into the moral architecture that underlies all economic behavior. The theory of moral sentiments represents Adam Smith's profound revelation that human moral behavior emerges from the complex interaction between individual psychology and social coordination, establishing the foundational ethics that later enabled his revolutionary economic insights. Smith developed this understanding through years of observing how people actually make moral judgments in real situations, noting that individuals consistently evaluate their own actions and those of others through an internal process he called the Impartial Spectator. This theoretical framework reveals that morality functions as a sophisticated form of social coordination, where individual empathy and sympathy naturally align with societal rules to promote cooperative behavior without requiring external enforcement mechanisms. The key insight centers on Smith's recognition that humans possess what he termed sympathetic imagination, the ability to consider how our actions appear to others, particularly how an impartial observer would evaluate our conduct, creating a natural internal system of moral accountability that guides behavior towards socially beneficial outcomes. The operational mechanisms of Smith's moral theory function through what he called sympathetic resonance, the psychological process by which individuals naturally adopt the perspective of others when making moral evaluations, creating an internal balancing act between personal desire and social appropriateness. This process manifests through several interconnected psychological operations. The original sentiment, our immediate emotional response to a situation; the sympathetic response, how we imagine others would react to that response; and the final moral judgment, the result of reconciling these perspectives through the impartial spectator's lens. The spectator operates as a kind of internal moral referee, assessing whether our intended actions would appear justified to a completely impartial observer who understands all relevant facts and emotional contexts. This creates what Smith identified as sympathetic approval, those moments when our actions feel genuinely right because they pass the test of imagined objective scrutiny, providing natural motivation for moral behavior that doesn't rely on external rewards, punishments, or authority figures. Contemporary application of Smith's moral theory illuminates how his insights explain modern social phenomena, from corporate governance scandals to social media behavior, where individuals navigate between personal interests and public accountability through psychological mechanisms that Smith identified centuries ago. In corporate environments, executives often justify questionable decisions by invoking utilitarian arguments about shareholder value. But Smith's Impartial Spectator suggests that genuine moral approval requires the decision to appear ethical from the perspective of a completely neutral observer. Social media platforms demonstrate Smith's theory through their content moderation challenges. Algorithms attempt to simulate impartial spectators, but the real moral policing emerges from users' natural tendency to consider how their posts would be perceived by diverse audiences. The Don't Me Too movement's effectiveness stemmed partly from how Smith's sympathetic mechanism made it possible for individuals to envision how their silence would appear to impartial observers, creating collective moral pressure that transcended legal enforcement. International climate negotiations similarly reflect Smith's understanding that global cooperation depends on each nation imagining how future generations would evaluate current policy choices. Understanding the theory of moral sentiments reveals that Smith's economic theories didn't emerge from mechanical calculations about self-interest, but from a sophisticated understanding of how moral psychology naturally produces social cooperation and beneficial outcomes through mechanisms that reconcile individual desires with collective welfare. This insight provides the crucial bridge between Smith's moral philosophy and his later economic thought, showing that market behavior operates within the same psychological frameworks that govern moral decision-making, ultimately explaining why free markets often generate socially beneficial results. The impartial spectator becomes a crucial element for understanding how Smith's invisible hand of market coordination actually functions. Through millions of individuals, each considering how their economic choices would appear to impartial observers, creating a natural system of moral accountability that guides market behavior toward beneficial social outcomes, even when participants act primarily from self-interest. The division of labor represents Smith's most transformative contribution to understanding economic productivity, introduced in the opening pages of The Wealth of Nations as the fundamental mechanism through which societies generate wealth and prosperity. Smith developed this insight through careful observation of actual manufacturing processes in 18th century Britain, recognizing that when complex production tasks are broken down into specialized operations performed by different workers, the resulting efficiency gains exceed anything achievable through individual craftsmanship. This discovery revolutionized economic thinking by identifying specialization not merely as a convenient arrangement, but as the primary driver of economic advancement, establishing the theoretical foundation for industrial capitalism and modern manufacturing systems that would emerge in the centuries following the book's publication in 1776. Smith illustrated this principle through his famous examination of pin manufacturing, demonstrating how a single worker performing all operations necessary to produce a pin, drawing wire, straightening it, cutting, pointing, grinding the head, attaching it, might struggle to complete even 20 pins daily, whereas 10 specialized workers dividing these operations among themselves could produce upwards of 48,000 pins in the same time frame. The theoretical framework underlying this dramatic productivity increase operates through three distinct mechanisms. First, increased dexterity that develops when workers repeat the same specialized task continuously rather than switching between different operations. Second, elimination of time lost in transitioning between different tasks and tools. And third, the greater likelihood that workers focused on single operations will discover improved methods or invent specialized machinery to facilitate their particular task. Smith argued that this specialization generates what he termed the multiplication of production, where the total output of specialized workers exceeds the sum of what those same individuals could produce working independently, creating genuine economic value through organizational structure rather than increased labor input or capital investment. The operational dynamics of labor division extend beyond individual workshops to shape entire economic systems through what Smith recognized as progressive specialization across industries and regions. As markets expand and trade networks develop, specialization intensifies because larger populations can support workers devoted to increasingly narrow tasks. The shoemaker who once produced complete shoes becomes specialized in cutting leather, while another focuses exclusively on stitching, and yet another on attaching soles. This process generates interdependence among specialized producers who must exchange their products to meet their diverse needs, creating the market relationships that Smith saw as foundational to economic coordination. The division of labor also drives technological innovation because workers intimately familiar with specific operations possess both the motivation and knowledge to develop improved tools and techniques, as Smith observed in the invention of specialized machinery by workers seeking to simplify their repetitive tasks. Furthermore, specialization enables the employment of workers with different skill levels in appropriate roles, matching expensive expertise to complex operations while assigning simpler tasks to less trained workers, thereby optimizing the deployment of human capabilities across the production process and reducing the overall cost of training workers for economic participation. Contemporary economic organization reflects Smith's insight into labor division with extraordinary fidelity. As modern supply chains fragment production across specialized facilities and geographic regions, a smartphone manufacturer coordinates hundreds of suppliers, producing specialized components like processors, cameras, and displays, each facility employing workers focused on narrow manufacturing operations, replicating Smith's pin factory logic at global scale. Software development exemplifies knowledge work specialization, where programmers focus exclusively on front-end interfaces, back-end databases, security protocols, or quality testing rather than building complete applications individually, generating productivity gains through concentrated expertise that parallel Smith's manufacturing observations. The gig economy and platform labor markets extend specialization to service provision, enabling individuals to offer highly specific skills, graphic design, data analysis, copywriting, virtual assistants to clients worldwide, creating markets for narrowly defined tasks that would be economically unviable without digital coordination infrastructure. However, contemporary experience also reveals tensions Smith only partially anticipated. Workers performing extremely narrow tasks often experience reduced autonomy, limited skill development, and disconnection from meaningful production outcomes, raising questions about whether maximal specialization serves human flourishing even as it enhances measurable productivity, a concern increasingly prominent in debates about automation, workforce development, and the psychological dimensions of modern employment structures. Understanding the division of labor illuminates why Smith viewed market expansion as essential to economic development, since specialization requires sufficiently large markets to support narrowly focused producers. Geographic isolation and small populations limit the degree of specialization economically viable, constraining productivity improvements that specialization enables. This insight explains Smith's advocacy for trade liberalization and his opposition to mercantilist restrictions that fragmented markets through tariffs and regulations, policies he saw as artificially limiting the extent of labor division and thereby suppressing economic growth. The concept also reveals the interdependence between specialization and other elements of Smith's economic framework. Specialized workers require extensive exchange mechanisms to obtain goods they no longer produce themselves, making market institutions and monetary systems indispensable to specialized economies. Smith's analysis of labor division thus establishes the foundation for understanding how decentralized economic coordination through markets enables complex production systems, a theme that will become central to examining how individual self-interest generates collective prosperity through mechanisms he would later characterize as the invisible hand guiding economic activity towards socially beneficial outcomes without centralized direction or conscious planning. Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand represents one of the most revolutionary and misunderstood ideas in economic philosophy, revealing how individual pursuit of self-interest can generate collective prosperity through mechanisms that operate beyond conscious intention. Smith developed this insight while observing the complex economic interactions in 18th century Britain, where he noted that merchants pursuing their own gain seemed to contribute inadvertently to broader economic welfare. This observation challenged the prevailing mercantilist doctrine that national wealth depended on government control and narrow protectionist policies. Smith recognized that something profound was happening when individuals made decisions based purely on their own interests, yet these decisions somehow aligned with broader social benefit. The invisible hand became his attempt to explain this remarkable phenomenon where private vice could become public virtue through the operation of market mechanisms. The theoretical framework underlying Smith's invisible hand emerges from his fundamental belief that individuals possess perfect knowledge of their own circumstances, while governments possess only imperfect knowledge of collective needs, making market coordination superior to central planning. This concept operates through the price system, where supply and demand signals guide resources toward their most valued uses, without any central director requiring specific outcomes. When consumers demand certain goods more intensely, prices rise, signaling producers where profit opportunities exist, while simultaneously discouraging consumption of relatively scarce resources. Smith argued that this process functions as if guided by an invisible hand because no individual actor comprehends the full scope of economic consequences. Yet the aggregate result serves the common good. The mechanism depends crucially on competition among producers, freedom of entry into markets, and the absence of artificial barriers that would distort price signals. The operational mechanisms of the invisible hand manifest through several interconnected processes that transform individual self-interest into collective benefit without requiring moral transformation of participants. Price signals automatically adjust resource allocation as entrepreneurs respond to profit opportunities by directing capital and labor toward higher value production, while competition forces efficiency improvements and innovation as firms strive to reduce costs and improve products. When markets are free and competitive, resources flow naturally toward their most productive uses because profit-seeking individuals consistently choose options that maximize their returns, thereby serving society's needs through the mechanism of voluntary exchange. Smith observed that this process occurs continuously and automatically, requiring no government coordination, moral instruction, or conscious regard for social welfare. The invisible hand functions most effectively when governments maintain minimal interference, allowing market participants to respond freely to price signals and competitive pressures. Contemporary applications of the invisible hand principle appear prominently in debates over regulatory approaches to modern markets, where policymakers grapple with questions of optimal government intervention in digital platforms, financial systems, and global trade relationships. Modern examples include gig economy platforms that coordinate millions of independent workers and consumers without central management, demonstrating how price mechanisms can efficiently match supply and demand across complex networks. However, contemporary critics challenge the invisible hand's efficacy when market failures emerge through information asymmetries, external costs, or power imbalances that prevent truly competitive conditions. The ongoing debate between laissez-faire approaches and regulatory intervention reflects fundamental questions about whether Smith's mechanisms operate effectively in modern contexts characterized by technological disruption, environmental challenges, and wealth concentration. These modern applications reveal both the enduring power and practical limitations of Smith's framework when applied to contemporary economic realities. Understanding the invisible hand provides crucial insights into the relationship between individual freedom and collective prosperity, suggesting that prosperity emerges not from altruistic intentions, but from properly structured institutions that harness self-interest toward social benefit. This perspective argues that economic systems function best when they allow individuals to pursue their goals freely within clear rules that prevent force and fraud, while avoiding the hubris of central planning that pretends to know optimal resource allocation. The invisible hand concept thus supports limited government roles in maintaining property rights, enforcing contracts, and ensuring competitive conditions, while discouraging extensive economic intervention that distorts market signals. This framework remains profoundly relevant for understanding how decentralized coordination can solve complex resource allocation problems that would overwhelm any planning authority, though it requires constant vigilance to maintain the competitive conditions necessary for its effective operation. Smith's critique of mercantilism represents one of economics' most transformative intellectual victories, directly challenging the prevailing economic orthodoxy that had dominated European policy for centuries. While governments across Europe had built their economic policies around the mercantilist principle that national wealth required controlling exports, restricting imports, and accumulating precious metals, Smith recognized this approach as fundamentally counterproductive to human prosperity. The mercantilist system, which Smith observed firsthand in 18th-century Britain, treated international trade as a zero-sum competition where one nation's gain necessarily meant another's loss. This perspective led to navigation acts, protective tariffs, and imperial trade monopolies that Smith argued were not only inefficient but actively harmful to both domestic productivity and international relations. His systematic dismantling of these beliefs established the foundation for modern international trade theory and economic liberalization policies that continue to shape global commerce today. At the core of Smith's theoretical framework lies the insight that mercantilist policies create artificial scarcity where natural abundance could flourish through voluntary exchange. The mercantilist obsession with trade surpluses and precious metal accumulation assumed that wealth consisted primarily of gold and silver holdings rather than productive capacity and consumer satisfaction. This misinterpretation led governments to impose restrictive measures that forced producers to sell goods at lower prices abroad while preventing consumers from purchasing cheaper imports domestically. Smith demonstrated that these restrictions violated the natural harmony between producers and consumers, creating inefficiencies that reduced overall economic welfare. Unlike mercantilism's zero-sum competitive framework, Smith's theory established economics as a positive-sum game where both trading partners could gain simultaneously through the division of labor and comparative advantage, transforming international commerce from a battlefield into a cooperative enterprise that increased global wealth. The operational mechanisms of Smith's critique became visible through his analysis of how trade restrictions generate systematic inefficiencies across multiple sectors. When governments impose protective tariffs, domestic industries lose competitive pressure that drives innovation and efficiency improvements, becoming complacent while consumers bear higher costs for inferior goods. Import restrictions create artificial bottlenecks that force resources into less productive activities, while simultaneously limiting access to superior foreign products that could enhance domestic productivity. Export subsidies distort natural price signals that guide resources toward their most valuable uses, misallocating capital and labor away from economically rational applications. These mechanisms work together to create what Smith called the mean and malignant envy of little artificers, where special interest groups lobby for protection at the expense of general economic welfare. By removing these artificial constraints, markets coordinate resources through price signals that naturally align individual incentives with collective prosperity. Contemporary applications of Smith's mercantilist critique emerge daily in modern trade policy debates, where nations struggle to balance domestic protection with global economic integration. Current tensions between free trade agreements and protectionist movements reflect the same fundamental questions Smith addressed centuries ago, as politicians debate tariffs on steel imports, restrictions on technology transfers, and trade barriers in response to globalization's challenges. Modern supply chains demonstrate Smith's insight that unrestricted trade creates wealth through specialization. Yet political pressures for reshoring, manufacturing, echo mercantilist desires for national self-sufficiency regardless of economic efficiency. Digital commerce platforms and e-commerce regulations show how removing trade barriers enables unprecedented global wealth creation, while simultaneously creating new forms of protectionist response from traditional industries. The ongoing debates over intellectual property protections, data localization requirements, and digital services taxes illustrate how Smith's analysis remains relevant when governments attempt to control international economic flows in ways that ultimately reduce global prosperity. Understanding Smith's critique of mercantilism illuminates how economic philosophy transforms from zero-sum competition toward cooperative abundance, establishing the intellectual foundation for modern globalization and international economic institutions. His systematic demolition of mercantilist assumptions demonstrated that restricting trade benefits narrow special interests while harming broader prosperity, revealing how apparently patriotic economic policies often serve the few at the expense of the many. This insight becomes particularly relevant as contemporary economies navigate between open market integration and protectionist responses to technological disruption and wealth inequality. Smith's analysis provides the theoretical framework for understanding why economic nationalism ultimately reduces rather than enhances national competitiveness, offering guidance for policymakers facing pressure to abandon free trade principles during economic uncertainty. The enduring power of his critique lies not just in defeating mercantilism, but in establishing the intellectual foundation for viewing international commerce as a cooperative enterprise that increases prosperity for all participating nations through voluntary exchange and mutual benefit. The concept of natural price represents one of Adam Smith's most significant contributions to understanding how economies achieve stability through systematic price determination. Smith developed this insight while observing the 18th century British market economy, where he noticed that despite constant fluctuations in market prices, certain fundamental price levels emerged and persisted over time. This natural price, he argued, was determined by the essential costs required to produce goods, including wages, raw materials, and the capital returns necessary to maintain productive capacity. Unlike temporary price movements caused by immediate supply and demand imbalances, natural price reflected the underlying economic equilibrium that would exist when markets operated under normal conditions. Smith's analysis revealed that recognizing these natural price levels was crucial for understanding long-term economic stability and for distinguishing between temporary market distortions and genuine value relationships. Smith's theoretical framework for natural price distinguished between two distinct pricing mechanisms operating simultaneously in market economies. The natural price represented the central price around which market prices constantly gravitated, determined by what Smith identified as the natural rate of wages, profits, and rent that prevailed in a given society. This natural rate varied according to geography, local customs, and the economic circumstances of different trades and locations. Market price, conversely, was the actual price paid in specific transactions, which could diverge significantly from natural price due to temporary factors such as weather disruptions, political events, or changes in consumer preferences. Smith's crucial insight was that while market prices fluctuated constantly based on immediate conditions, these movements occurred around the stable foundation of natural price, creating a self-correcting mechanism that restored equilibrium when temporary distortions dissipated. This framework provided a systematic way to understand both short-term market volatility and long-term economic value relationships. The operational mechanism of natural price operates through a dynamic process of market adjustment that Smith observed throughout his analysis of commercial society. When market prices rise above natural price due to temporary shortages or increased demand, profitable opportunities emerge for producers to increase supply, attract additional resources, and expand production capacity. This increased production gradually brings market prices back toward natural levels as supply expands to meet demand. Conversely, when market prices fall below natural price due to temporary oversupply or reduced demand, unprofitable conditions discourage production and resource allocation, gradually reducing supply until prices rise back toward natural levels. This process occurs continuously across the economy as thousands of individual markets adjust through price signals, creating a decentralized coordination system that effectively matches supply with demand across complex economic networks. Smith's insight was recognizing that this seemingly chaotic process actually produced systematic results, with natural price serving as the gravitational center around which market prices orbited. Understanding natural price has profound implications for contemporary economic policy and business decision-making in modern market economies. Government officials use natural price analysis to distinguish between temporary price spikes caused by supply disruptions and genuine value changes that warrant policy responses, such as distinguishing between weather-related food price increases and fundamental changes in agricultural productivity. Central banks apply natural price concepts when evaluating inflation trends, distinguishing between temporary price volatility and sustained inflationary pressures that require monetary policy intervention. Businesses utilize natural price frameworks when making strategic decisions about production capacity, inventory levels, and pricing strategies, using natural price as a reference point for evaluating whether market prices reflect sustainable value relationships. International trade negotiators employ natural price analysis when assessing whether cross-border price differences represent genuine efficiency gains or artificial distortions requiring policy attention, informing decisions about tariffs, trade agreements, and market access rules. The natural price concept integrates seamlessly with Smith's broader philosophical framework, providing essential grounding for his revolutionary economic theory while illuminating his fundamental insights about how markets coordinate human activity. This concept demonstrates Smith's recognition that economic systems operate according to systematic principles rather than random forces, principles that emerge naturally from human interactions rather than requiring central direction. The natural price mechanism exemplifies the invisible hand theory explored previously, showing how individual pursuit of profit maximization in competitive markets produces outcomes beneficial to society as a whole. Understanding natural price also illuminates Smith's critique of mercantilism, revealing how artificial trade restrictions and price controls artificially distort the natural price relationships that coordinate economic activity efficiently. As we continue exploring Smith's economic philosophy, the natural price concept will serve as a crucial foundation for understanding his analysis of wealth distribution, labor value, and the ethical dimensions of economic policy that transform individual motivations into collective prosperity. The relationship between self-interest and altruism represents one of Adam Smith's most sophisticated insights into human economic behavior, revealing how personal motivation and social benefit intertwine in ways that neither pure selfishness nor absolute selflessness could achieve. Smith's recognition that individuals pursuing their own gain naturally contribute to collective prosperity emerged from his deeper understanding of human psychology developed in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he explored how sympathy and moral judgment function in society. This balance between individual pursuit and social contribution forms the foundation upon which his later economic theories, including the invisible hand mechanism and natural price system, operate as coherent frameworks for understanding market coordination. Smith's theoretical framework distinguishes between what he called the evident design of nature and the often invisible social mechanisms that channel individual pursuit of gain into outcomes benefiting society at large. The framework operates through what Smith identified as the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another, a fundamental human tendency that creates the conditions for mutually beneficial transactions, even when participants focus primarily on their own interests. This mechanism depends upon the impartial spectator, the internalized moral conscience developed through the theory of moral sentiments, which serves as an internal governor, ensuring that transactions remain within socially acceptable bounds, while still allowing competitive advantage and profit maximization to drive economic activity forward. The operational dynamics of this balance manifest through the price system that Smith developed alongside his natural price theory, where competitive pressures constantly realign individual interests with social needs. When consumers demand certain goods or services more urgently, prices rise, signaling profit opportunities that attract entrepreneurs and workers into those sectors, thereby increasing supply to meet demand without central coordination. Simultaneously, the moral constraints identified in the theory of moral sentiments prevent purely exploitative behavior by creating reputational consequences and internal moral discomfort that limit the extent to which individuals can pursue gain at others' expense. This creates a self-regulating system where market signals and moral sentiment work in concert to align private incentives with public benefit. Contemporary applications of Smith's self-interest versus altruism framework appear most clearly in modern corporate governance debates, where executives face competing obligations to shareholders, employees, customers, and broader society. Technology platforms like Amazon or Uber coordinate vast networks of independent buyers and sellers through algorithms that neither these companies nor their users consciously designed to maximize social benefit. Yet the systems emerge from individual decisions pursuing profit and convenience. International supply chains demonstrate similar dynamics, where thousands of independent firms pursuing their own commercial interests collectively deliver affordable products to global consumers, while simultaneously creating employment and economic development in developing regions. However, recent debates over corporate social responsibility and wealth inequality highlight situations where pure self-interest may overwhelm the balancing mechanisms that Smith assumed would naturally emerge. Understanding Smith's nuanced view of self-interest and altruism illuminates why his economic theories require the moral foundations established in the theory of moral sentiments to function effectively, suggesting that purely technical solutions to market failures may be insufficient without corresponding attention to moral education and institutional frameworks that support ethical behavior. This insight proves crucial for contemporary policy discussions about regulating emerging technologies, addressing climate change, and managing global economic integration, where understanding how individual incentives can be channeled toward collective benefit remains as relevant today as it was in 18th century Scotland. Smith's environmental ethics represent one of the most forward-thinking dimensions of his philosophical system, anticipating by centuries the central challenge of balancing economic development with ecological sustainability. While modern readers often associate Smith primarily with market mechanisms and economic liberalization, his deeper ethical framework from the theory of moral sentiments reveals a sophisticated understanding of humanity's moral obligations to the natural world. Smith recognized that human economic activities occur within natural constraints and that short-sighted exploitation undermines both environmental integrity and long-term prosperity. This insight emerges from his broader commitment to understanding how human societies can flourish without compromising the foundations upon which that flourishing depends. The theoretical framework for Smith's environmental ethics rests upon his concept of the impartial spectator applied to ecological relationships, extending moral consideration beyond immediate human communities to include natural systems themselves. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith argued that moral approval arises when individuals can imagine how an impartial observer would judge their actions, considering not just personal consequences, but broader impacts on human welfare. When applied to environmental decisions, this framework requires individuals and societies to consider how natural resource depletion, pollution, or ecosystem disruption would appear to a spectator concerned with long-term human flourishing. Smith also developed what might be called systemic thinking about the relationship between economic activity and natural limits, recognizing that markets function best when they account for true costs and benefits rather than merely immediate transactional considerations. Smith operationalized environmental ethics through what he termed the proper natural employment of resources, emphasizing that sustainable practices emerge when economic actors recognize their long-term self-interest aligns with environmental stewardship. His analysis of market failures centered on situations where short-term profit maximization creates long-term costs that markets fail to account for without appropriate institutional frameworks. Smith observed that sustainable forestry practices emerge when forest owners recognize that maintaining productive forests serves their long-term economic interests, while unsustainable exploitation occurs when ownership structures or time horizons prevent such rational calculation. Similarly, his analysis of trade patterns suggested that regions developing specialized expertise in sustainable resource management would outperform those depleting natural capital for immediate gains, creating economic incentives for environmental protection through market mechanisms rather than government mandates. Contemporary environmental challenges demonstrate the continuing relevance of Smith's ethical framework, particularly in debates over carbon pricing, sustainable supply chains, and corporate environmental responsibility. Modern carbon markets operationalize Smith's insight that environmental costs should be incorporated into market calculations, creating price signals that reward sustainable practices and penalize harmful ones. Corporate sustainability initiatives often reflect what Smith would recognize as enlightened self-interest, where companies recognize that long-term profitability depends upon maintaining healthy ecosystems and social relationships. International climate negotiations draw upon Smith's analysis of how competing national interests can be reconciled through institutional frameworks that make sustainable practices economically rational. Supply chain transparency requirements reflect Smith's insistence that markets function most effectively when participants can assess the true costs and benefits of their economic choices, including environmental externalities. Understanding Smith's environmental ethics illuminates the coherence of his philosophical system, demonstrating how his economic theories rest upon deeper moral foundations concerning human flourishing within natural constraints. Smith's integration of the theory of moral sentiments with the wealth of nations reveals that free markets, when properly understood, require ethical frameworks that account for long-term consequences and systemic relationships. This synthesis provides guidance for contemporary policy debates about how to harness market mechanisms while addressing environmental challenges that markets alone cannot resolve. Smith's environmental insights suggest that the most sustainable approach combines institutional frameworks that make sustainable practices economically rational with cultural development that cultivates the moral imagination necessary for considering long-term consequences. This framework offers a middle path between unchecked economic exploitation and environmental policies that ignore the practical constraints and incentives that shape human behavior. Adam Smith's conception of governmental authority represents one of the most nuanced and misunderstood aspects of his economic philosophy, revealing a sophisticated understanding of when state intervention serves rather than undermines market efficiency. Rather than advocating for unrestricted laissez-faire policies as commonly caricatured, Smith developed a carefully limited framework of governmental functions that complement rather than replace market mechanisms. This perspective emerges from his dual recognition that markets possess remarkable self-organizing capabilities, while simultaneously requiring certain essential protections and infrastructures that individuals cannot provide for themselves. Smith's governmental philosophy thus establishes clear boundaries between legitimate state functions and activities better left to private initiative, creating the foundation for modern discussions about the optimal scope of political authority in economic life. Smith identified three fundamental governmental responsibilities that form the theoretical foundation of limited intervention: protecting society from external threats and internal injustice, providing public goods that benefit everyone but cannot be efficiently supplied by private markets, and maintaining the institutional frameworks necessary for economic exchange. The protection function encompasses both national defense against foreign aggression and domestic law enforcement that secures property rights and contracts, ensuring that market participants can engage in transactions with confidence that the rules will be fairly enforced. Public goods provision includes infrastructure projects such as roads, bridges, and waterways that facilitate commerce, but generate benefits too diffuse for private profit-seeking to motivate adequate supply. Institutional maintenance involves establishing and maintaining the legal, educational, and regulatory structures that enable complex market societies to function smoothly, from coinage systems to court procedures that resolve commercial disputes. These governmental mechanisms operate through specific operational patterns that distinguish legitimate state functions from inappropriate market interference. Protection functions work through established legal procedures that apply equally to all citizens, creating predictable rules that enable long-term economic planning without requiring constant negotiation of security arrangements. Public goods provision operates through collective funding mechanisms that overcome the free rider problems inherent in infrastructure and education, where individual beneficiaries cannot be easily identified or charged. Institutional maintenance functions through establishing clear standards and procedures that reduce transaction costs and uncertainty, enabling more complex forms of economic cooperation and specialization. The key insight is that these functions support rather than substitute for market mechanisms, creating conditions that allow decentralized decision-making to produce optimal outcomes while addressing genuine market failures. Contemporary governance debates frequently reference Smith's framework when evaluating optimal regulatory structures for digital platforms, financial markets, and social safety nets. Modern policy discussions about antitrust enforcement draw directly on Smith's insights about how concentrated market power can undermine competitive mechanisms that drive innovation and efficiency. Healthcare policy debates invoke Smith's public goods analysis when considering whether universal coverage represents infrastructure necessary for human capital development. Environmental regulation questions engage Smith's framework for addressing externalities, where private market decisions generate costs borne by broader society. These applications demonstrate how Smith's limited government principles provide analytical tools for distinguishing between situations requiring collective action and those where individual initiative produces superior outcomes, offering guidance for the recurring political tensions between market freedom and social responsibility. Understanding Smith's governmental philosophy illuminates the broader coherence of his economic system, revealing how limited political authority serves rather than contradicts his vision of decentralized prosperity. This perspective suggests that effective governance requires identifying the specific conditions under which collective action overcomes market limitations without undermining the spontaneous order that generates wealth and innovation. The ongoing relevance of Smith's framework lies in its provision of principled criteria for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate governmental intervention, offering a foundation for navigating the complex policy questions that arise when markets generate both prosperity and inequality, progress and disruption. As democratic societies continue debating the proper scope of political authority, Smith's nuanced approach to governmental roles provides essential insights for designing institutions that harness market dynamism while addressing genuine collective needs. The distribution of wealth within society represents one of the most contentious aspects of Adam Smith's economic philosophy, revealing inherent tensions between his free market principles and his moral philosophy concerns. While Smith's theory of the invisible hand suggests that market mechanisms naturally optimize resource allocation, he simultaneously acknowledged that unregulated markets tend to create significant wealth inequalities. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith observed that civil society's progression cannot be regarded as an advantage to the great body of the people when excessive wealth concentration occurs. This recognition of distributional challenges within his otherwise laissez-faire framework demonstrates Smith's nuanced understanding that market efficiency does not automatically guarantee social equity. The tension between these perspectives forms a critical axis around which modern debates about economic policy continue to revolve. The theoretical foundation of Smith's perspective on wealth distribution rests upon a sophisticated synthesis of economic liberty and moral obligation that he developed through his dual authorship of The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations. Smith's moral philosophy framework emphasizes the importance of sympathy and the impartial spectator as mechanisms for evaluating social arrangements, suggesting that extreme inequalities might fail to generate the moral approval that sustainable social orders require. Simultaneously, his economic analysis identified natural price mechanisms and competitive markets as the most efficient means of generating prosperity. Yet he recognized that these mechanisms operate within institutional contexts shaped by historical, cultural, and political factors. This dual framework creates a complex calculus where free market principles represent necessary conditions for economic prosperity, but not necessarily sufficient conditions for achieving morally desirable social outcomes. The resulting perspective allows for market-based wealth creation while maintaining ethical standards that may necessitate redistributive interventions when market outcomes violate fundamental moral principles. The operational mechanisms through which Smith's wealth distribution perspective manifests involve a dynamic interplay between market forces, institutional frameworks, and moral considerations that unfold across different temporal horizons. In the immediate term, Smith's natural price system channels resources toward their most productive uses through competitive pressures that tend to concentrate wealth among efficient producers while penalizing inefficient ones. However, his analysis also identified counterbalancing mechanisms within the market system itself, including wage competition that tends to equalize compensation across similar occupations and the tendency of high profits in one sector to attract competitors, eventually reducing those profits. At the institutional level, Smith advocated for specific government interventions to address market failures and distributional concerns, including public goods provision, progressive tax considerations, and regulations preventing monopolistic practices that would distort market outcomes. These interventions follow from his recognition that markets operate within political and social contexts, requiring deliberate institutional design to optimize both efficiency and equity outcomes. Contemporary applications of Smith's wealth distribution framework appear most visibly in debates surrounding progressive taxation systems, social safety net programs, and broader welfare state policies that attempt to reconcile market efficiency with distributional concerns. Modern progressive tax structures, implementing graduated rates based on income levels, directly reflect Smith's recognition that while markets should primarily determine resource allocation, institutional mechanisms may be necessary to address excessive inequality. Similarly, social insurance programs, unemployment benefits, and healthcare safety nets exemplify Smith's institutional approach to wealth distribution through public provision of essential goods that markets may fail to deliver equitably. The ongoing tension between these redistribution mechanisms and free market efficiency concerns continues to shape policy debates across the political spectrum, with each side claiming Smith's intellectual authority. Contemporary economic policy frameworks attempting to balance these concerns, such as universal basic income pilot programs or conditional cash transfer systems, represent practical attempts to operationalize Smith's complex vision of wealth distribution within modern institutional contexts. The integrative implications of Smith's approach to wealth distribution extend beyond immediate policy considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between economic prosperity and social cohesion in modern societies. Smith's framework suggests that sustainable economic systems require not only efficient resource allocation, but also morally legitimate distributional outcomes that maintain social stability and cooperation. This perspective provides intellectual foundations for contemporary arguments that excessive wealth concentration undermines market efficiency by reducing aggregate demand, creating political instability that threatens property rights, or generating social tensions that impede productive economic activity. Simultaneously, Smith's framework cautions against redistributive policies that undermine market incentives necessary for generating prosperity, recognizing that overly aggressive redistribution may ultimately harm those it intends to benefit by reducing overall economic growth. The enduring relevance of Smith's perspective lies in its recognition that wealth distribution questions cannot be resolved through purely technical economic analysis, but require ongoing ethical deliberation within institutional frameworks designed to balance competing values of efficiency, equity, and social harmony. The Wealth of Nations has profoundly shaped economic thought since its 1776 publication, establishing foundational principles of free market operation that continue defining modern economic discourse. Smith's comprehensive analysis transcended mere economic theory to become an intellectual framework, influencing political science, sociology, and contemporary policy-making across diverse nations and political systems. The work's enduring relevance stems from its systematic articulation of market dynamics, competitive mechanisms, and the complex relationship between individual self-interest and collective prosperity. This intellectual foundation proved remarkably prescient, providing analytical tools that remain essential for understanding modern economic phenomena from digital platforms to global supply chains. The theoretical framework Smith established rests upon several interconnected concepts that transformed economic analysis: the division of labor enabling productivity gains through specialization, competitive markets that naturally regulate prices through supply and demand dynamics, and the invisible hand mechanism that coordinates decentralized individual decisions toward optimal social outcomes. These principles collectively created what Smith termed the natural system of liberty, wherein market forces, rather than governmental intervention, determine optimal resource allocation. The work's systematic methodology combined empirical observation with theoretical analysis, establishing economics as a distinct analytical discipline with its own methodologies and predictive capabilities. This framework introduced concepts of market equilibrium, efficiency, and the role of information in economic coordination that continue defining contemporary economic research. The operational mechanisms Smith identified function through specific patterns of market behavior. Competitive pressure drives innovation and cost reduction as firms seek profitability advantages. Specialization enables economies of scale that lower production costs and increase output quality. And price signals coordinate millions of independent economic decisions through the natural price system that reflects true supply and demand conditions. These mechanisms operate through feedback loops where market successes attract competition, eventually eliminating excess profits, while failures lead to exit or adaptation. The institutional framework Smith described includes property rights protection, contract enforcement, and limited government intervention that creates conditions necessary for these market mechanisms to function effectively. Understanding these operational dynamics provides analytical tools for evaluating contemporary economic phenomena and policy interventions. Contemporary application of Smith's framework appears throughout modern economic policy debates, International trade agreements rely upon Smith's arguments for specialization gains and comparative advantage. Regulatory discussions about technology platforms apply invisible hand principles to digital markets, and debates over wealth inequality reference Smith's recognition that excessive concentration threatens the competitive conditions necessary for market efficiency. Modern antitrust enforcement uses Smith's insights about competitive markets, promoting innovation and consumer welfare, while discussions of universal basic income draw upon Smith's recognition of social obligations and the need to address market failures. Climate change policy debates increasingly incorporate Smith's insights about external costs and the need for institutional frameworks that align individual incentives with collective welfare. These applications demonstrate the framework's continued relevance for analyzing complex contemporary challenges. The integrative implications of understanding Smith's legacy reveal how economic theory development depends upon both analytical rigor and ethical foundations established in the theory of moral sentiments, creating a comprehensive framework that addresses both efficiency and moral dimensions of economic systems. Smith's approach demonstrates how economic analysis benefits from incorporating psychological insights about human motivation and behavior, while ethical theory gains practical relevance through connection with concrete economic mechanisms. This integration anticipates contemporary movements toward behavioral economics and the recognition that effective policy requires understanding both rational calculations and social motivations. The enduring power of Smith's framework lies not merely in its analytical insights, but in its demonstration that economic theory serves human flourishing when grounded in moral understanding and institutional wisdom, providing a model for how academic disciplines can develop while maintaining connection to practical human concerns. Adam Smith's economic insights extend far beyond domestic markets, reaching into the realm of global economic interdependence that we recognize today as globalization. While 18th-century merchants and policymakers operated within relatively localized trade networks, Smith possessed the remarkable intellectual capacity to anticipate how free trade and open borders would eventually bind nations together through mutual economic dependency. His theoretical framework established the logical foundation for understanding how competitive advantages, specialization gains, and market efficiency would naturally transcend geographic boundaries. Smith's global vision emerged from his systematic analysis of comparative advantage, where he demonstrated that nations prosper when they focus on producing goods where they possess natural or developed efficiencies, then exchange these specialized outputs with other nations for their specialized products. This international division of labor, operating through the invisible hand mechanism, creates economic benefits that exceed what any nation could achieve through self-sufficiency alone. The theoretical mechanisms Smith identified as driving economic interdependence operate through several interconnected processes that have proven remarkably prescient in our globalized world. His analysis of how increased specialization requires larger markets to be economically viable directly anticipated the modern phenomenon where companies must operate internationally to achieve sufficient scale for their specialized production methods. Smith recognized that technological improvements in transportation and communication would continuously reduce the frictions that historically limited international commerce, creating what he called commercial connections that would eventually make national economies more interdependent than independent. The Smithian framework also identified how competitive pressures within domestic markets would eventually push successful firms toward international expansion, where they could escape local competition and achieve greater efficiency through access to global consumer bases. These mechanisms, combined with his understanding of comparative advantage, create a theoretical model where economic integration becomes not merely beneficial, but inevitable. The operational mechanisms Smith predicted manifest through observable patterns in today's globally interconnected economy that validate his theoretical insights about international specialization and trade. Modern supply chains demonstrate exactly what Smith anticipated. Specialized production facilities in different countries coordinate their activities to create complex products that no single nation could produce as efficiently or affordably through domestic production alone. Smartphone manufacturing illustrates this process perfectly, where processors are designed in California, manufactured using components from Taiwan and South Korea, assembled in China using materials from Australia and rare earth elements from Africa, then distributed globally through logistics networks spanning multiple continents. Digital technology platforms like Amazon and Alibaba operate according to the Smithian model of using market mechanisms to coordinate millions of independent producers and consumers across international boundaries, creating emergent outcomes that no central authority could design or manage effectively. Contemporary global economic challenges directly validate Smith's predictions about the complexity and significance of international economic interdependence in shaping modern economic, social, and political landscapes. Trade wars between major economies demonstrate how political decisions to restrict international commerce immediately ripple through global supply chains, affecting employment and pricing in countries far removed from the original dispute. The COVID-19 pandemic's economic impact showed how disruptions in specialized production networks in one region can cause shortages of essential goods worldwide, validating Smith's insight about the fragility inherent in highly specialized international systems. Cryptocurrency markets and digital services create new forms of economic interdependence that operate beyond traditional national boundaries, where regulatory decisions in one jurisdiction can affect global price movements and market stability. International climate negotiations reveal how environmental challenges require coordinated responses among nations that depend on each other economically but must reconcile competing national interests with collective action problems. Understanding Smith's historical foresight in anticipating globalization provides crucial insights for navigating the complexities of contemporary international economic relations while highlighting the enduring relevance of his theoretical framework. His analysis of comparative advantage offers valuable guidance for nations seeking to identify their competitive positions within global value chains, suggesting that economic prosperity comes from developing specialized capabilities rather than attempting to replicate all production activities domestically. Smith's recognition of how technological advances continuously reshape economic relationships provides a framework for understanding how emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and renewable energy will continue to reorganize global production and trade patterns. The Smithian approach to international economics also illuminates the trade-offs inherent in globalization. While specialization and scale create enormous efficiencies and prosperity, they also create dependencies that can be politically destabilizing during periods of disruption or conflict. His insights about institutional arrangements being essential for facilitating complex economic interactions across national boundaries remain relevant for designing international governance structures capable of managing the challenges of a globally integrated economy while preserving the benefits of specialization and trade that his theory so accurately predicted and explained. Adam Smith's economic philosophies have fundamentally shaped the architecture of modern policy frameworks across developed nations, establishing the intellectual foundation for contemporary market-oriented reforms that prioritize efficiency, competition, and limited governmental intervention. His principles, originally articulated to challenge mercantilist restrictions in 18th-century Britain, now inform deregulatory initiatives, privatization programs, and tax policies that attempt to harness market mechanisms for economic prosperity. These policy applications reflect Smith's conviction that decentralized decision-making by individuals pursuing their self-interest, when properly structured within institutional frameworks, produces superior outcomes compared to centralized economic planning. Understanding this connection reveals how a philosopher who never held political office became one of the most influential policy architects in human history, with his ideas continuing to guide fiscal and regulatory debates in the 21st century. The theoretical framework underlying modern policy applications derives from Smith's distinction between the natural system of liberty and artificial governmental constraints that distort market efficiency. His principles advocate minimal state intervention in economic affairs, arguing that markets possess inherent self-regulating mechanisms when competition remains vigorous and barriers to entry remain low. Smith's emphasis on competitive markets as the primary engine of economic progress translates into policy preferences for deregulation that reduces administrative burdens, privatization that transfers state enterprises to private ownership, and tax reform that minimizes distortions to market incentives. This framework assumes that individual actors, responding to price signals and profit opportunities, possess superior knowledge about their own interests compared to government planners, making decentralized decision-making more efficient than centralized allocation. The framework also recognizes limited but crucial roles for government in providing public goods, enforcing property rights, and addressing market failures that private mechanisms cannot resolve effectively. Operational mechanisms of market-oriented reforms implement Smith's principles through specific policy instruments designed to enhance competition, reduce transaction costs, and align private incentives with social objectives. Deregulation programs eliminate artificial barriers to entry in industries such as telecommunications, transportation, and financial services, enabling new competitors to challenge established firms and drive innovation through competitive pressure. Privatization initiatives transfer ownership and management of state-controlled enterprises to private investors, assuming that market discipline will improve efficiency and resource allocation compared to bureaucratic management. Tax reform measures reduce marginal tax rates, eliminate loopholes, and simplify compliance requirements to minimize distortions to economic behavior while generating revenue through broader bases and lower rates. These mechanisms operate through Smith's invisible hand logic, where policy changes alter incentives faced by economic actors, leading to emergent outcomes that policymakers cannot predict or control, but that serve broader economic objectives when institutional frameworks remain competitive. Contemporary applications of Smith's policy framework manifest in regulatory reforms targeting technology platforms, financial market simplification, and international trade liberalization agreements that reduce governmental constraints on commercial activity. Telecommunications deregulation in the 1980s and 1990s eliminated monopolistic structures, leading to dramatic price reductions and innovation in communication services that Smith would have recognized as classic competitive market outcomes. Financial market deregulation simplified lending requirements and expanded permissible activities for banks and investment firms, operating on Smith's assumption that competitive pressures would naturally constrain risky behavior while artificial safety net provisions created moral hazard problems. Tax reform initiatives in multiple countries have reduced corporate tax rates, simplified personal income tax brackets, and eliminated preferential treatment for specific industries or activities, reflecting Smith's principle that neutral tax systems minimize economic distortions. Trade liberalization agreements reduce tariffs and regulatory barriers to international commerce, enabling global specialization patterns that align with Smith's predictions about the gains from division of labor at international scale. The ongoing debates surrounding these policy applications reveal fundamental tensions between Smith's vision of minimal government intervention and contemporary concerns about market failures, inequality, and institutional stability that his original framework did not fully address. Critics argue that unregulated markets can create external costs, information asymmetries, and power concentrations that undermine the competitive conditions Smith assumed were necessary for optimal outcomes. Supporters counter that government intervention often creates larger problems than it solves, generating bureaucratic inefficiency, political capture by special interests, and innovation suppression that ultimately harms the very populations policymakers seek to protect. These debates reflect deeper questions about the appropriate equilibrium between market self-regulation and governmental oversight that Smith's original insights identified but did not resolve definitively. The continuing relevance of Smith's framework lies not in providing definitive answers to these tensions, but in establishing the analytical tools and conceptual foundations that enable systematic examination of how institutional arrangements affect economic outcomes and social welfare, ensuring that policy debates remain grounded in rigorous analysis rather than ideological preferences or political convenience. Adam Smith's most profound achievement lies not in his individual economic discoveries, but in his synthesis of moral philosophy and economic analysis into a unified vision of human society. This integration represents a philosophical breakthrough that transformed how we understand the relationship between individual motivation and collective outcomes, revealing that moral sentiments and economic interests need not exist in opposition, but can converge naturally toward societal benefit. Smith's dual authorship of the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations created the foundation for this synthesis, demonstrating that markets function within moral frameworks rather than outside them. The theoretical framework of Smith's integration rests upon his recognition that human behavior is fundamentally shaped by our capacity for moral judgment and our ability to imagine how our actions appear to impartial observers. This psychological foundation allows economic actors to balance self-interest with social responsibility, creating market dynamics that generate both efficiency and ethical outcomes. Smith's concept of the impartial spectator becomes the invisible hand that guides market participants towards socially beneficial behaviors, even when pursuing individual goals. The moral sentiments provide the psychological mechanisms that align personal incentives with collective well-being. The operational mechanisms of Smith's unified approach manifest through how markets naturally incorporate ethical constraints while driving prosperity. When buyers and sellers engage in trade, they must consider not only price, but reputation, quality, and long-term relationships, creating natural boundaries around purely exploitative behavior. Competition forces producers to innovate and improve products, benefiting consumers while building efficient markets. Regulatory frameworks emerge from collective moral judgments about fair dealing, property rights, and justice, creating institutional structures that enable market function while preventing abuse. Contemporary applications of Smith's integrated vision appear in modern corporate governance debates, where companies must balance shareholder returns with employee welfare, environmental sustainability, and community impact. The rise of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) investing reflects Smith's insight that moral considerations naturally enter market calculations when viewed through the lens of long-term thinking and stakeholder impact. Digital platforms like social media companies face similar integration challenges, needing to optimize user engagement while preventing harmful content and protecting privacy, demonstrating how moral constraints become market necessities rather than obstacles. This philosophical synthesis provides a maxim for sustainable economic environments. Markets function most effectively when ethical considerations become integral to economic decision-making rather than external constraints imposed upon it. Understanding this integration illuminates how Smith envisioned the relationship between individual liberty and collective benefit, suggesting that the most prosperous societies are those that harness moral psychology to create market dynamics that serve human flourishing. The synthesis points toward economic systems that respect both the profit motive and ethical imperatives, creating conditions where prosperity and virtue reinforce rather than undermine each other. Adam Smith's ultimate philosophical aspiration represents the culmination of his revolutionary economic framework, envisioning economic systems that simultaneously nurture individual liberty while fostering societal prosperity. This vision emerged from Smith's deep understanding of human nature, developed through his groundbreaking work in moral philosophy and economic analysis. Smith's comprehensive approach rejects the false binary between individual freedom and collective well-being, instead proposing structures that harness personal motivations toward genuine wealth creation and moral development. The stakes of understanding Smith's ultimate goals extend beyond academic theory, offering profound insights into how societies can organize economic life in ways that honor human dignity while promoting shared prosperity. Smith's theoretical framework for achieving these dual objectives centers on creating institutional arrangements that align private interests with public benefit through what he termed the natural system of liberty. This framework operates on the premise that individuals pursuing their self-interest within properly structured markets naturally generate outcomes that serve broader social welfare. The key insight lies in understanding how moral sentiments, market mechanisms, and appropriate government functions can work synergistically rather than in opposition. Smith's framework distinguishes between genuine liberty, which enables human flourishing within just institutional constraints, and mere license, which undermines both individual development and social cohesion by allowing interests to override ethical considerations. The operational mechanisms of Smith's vision function through several interconnected processes that transform individual motivations into collective benefit. Competition drives innovation and efficiency, while the division of labor increases productivity while developing human capabilities through specialized work. Market price systems provide information that coordinates decentralized decision-making across complex economic networks. Moral sentiments, operating through Smith's impartial spectator mechanism, constrain purely instrumental behavior and promote consideration of others. Welfare. Appropriate government functions, protection, justice, and public works create the institutional foundations that enable markets to operate fairly while addressing areas where purely private calculations prove inadequate. Contemporary applications of Smith's ultimate goals illuminate ongoing debates about economic policy and institutional design across global societies. Modern discussions about wealth inequality often reference Smith's recognition that excessive concentration can undermine both economic efficiency and political stability, challenging purely libertarian interpretations of his work. Climate change policy debates increasingly invoke Smith's insights about external costs and the need for institutional frameworks that align private incentives with environmental stewardship. Technology platform regulation reflects Smith's understanding of how markets can generate positive sum outcomes when properly structured, while identifying conditions where intervention becomes necessary to preserve competitive dynamics and protect consumer welfare. Understanding Smith's ultimate philosophical goals provides a unifying framework for evaluating contemporary economic policies and institutional arrangements through the lens of humanistic values. His vision offers guidance for navigating the fundamental tension between individual liberty and social responsibility that continues to shape political and economic discourse. Rather than providing simplistic solutions, Smith's approach encourages ongoing inquiry into how societies can create economic systems that genuinely serve human flourishing. This enduring relevance demonstrates why Smith's insights about the relationship between markets, morality, and human development remain essential for understanding how economic systems can be designed to promote both individual dignity and collective prosperity.